Continuing with the chapter Origins and Effects of War, that's chapter 3 of Listen Humanity, and we're on page 133, the bottom of 133. Wars require the exercise of cooperative functioning, and in this resides one positive result. Still, the value of this cooperation should turn the page, should not be overestimated. For too often, it is artificially restricted by identification with a limited group or ideal. Often wars are carried on by a form of love, but a love that has not been properly understood. In order that love may come into its own, it must be free, untrammeled, and unlimited. Love exists in all phases of human life, but usually it is latent, or it is limited and poisoned by personal ambition, racial pride, narrow loyalties and rivalries, and attachment to sex, nationality, sect, caste, or religion. For the resurrection of humanity, the heart of man must be unlocked so that unadulterated love may be manifested in it, a love uncorrupted and free from me and mine. People who make unlimited sacrifices for the sake of their country or political ideology are also capable of the same sacrifices for God and the truth. As war teaches that even the man in the street can rise to the greatest heights of sacrifice for a selfless cause, it also teaches that all the mundane things of the world, wealth, possessions, power, fame, family, and even the very tenor of life on earth are transitory and devoid of lasting value. In this manner, the incidents of war also win man over for God through the lessons they bring. It is now high time that universal suffering should hasten humanity to the turning point in its spiritual history. It is now high time that the very agonies of our times should become a means for the bringing of real understanding of human relationship. It is now high time for humanity to face squarely the true causes of the catastrophe of war. It is now high time to seek a new experience of reality. It is high time that men have a fresh vision that all life is one in God, who alone is real and all that matters. God is worth living for, and he is worth dying for. All else is a vain and empty pursuit of illusory value. War is a necessary evil that is in God's plan to awaken humanity to its destiny as the new humanity. The time is now ripe. Men and women are ardently seeking to contact the embodiment of the truth in the form of a God-man, through whom they can be inspired and lifted into spiritual understanding. In this critical time of universal suffering, men and women are becoming ready to turn towards their higher self and to fulfill the will of God. They will accept the divine guidance and love, which alone can bring about spiritual awakening. Divine love will perform the supreme miracle of bringing God into the hearts of the new humanity and of establishing them in a true and therefore a lasting happiness. Divine love will satisfy the greatest longings of mankind, make men and women selfless and helpful in their mutual relations, and ultimately resolve all problems. The new sisterhood and brotherhood on earth will be a fulfilled fact, and nations will be united in the fraternity of love and truth. What will be some of the characteristics of the new humanity that will emerge from the travail of the present? It will, of course, heed science and its practical attainments. It is a mistake to look upon science as opposed to the spirit. Science is a help or hindrance to spirituality, depending upon the use to which it is put. Just as healthy art is the outflowing of spirituality, so science, when properly handled, can be the expression and fulfillment of the spirit. Scientific truths about the physical body and its life in the gross world can become a medium for the soul to know itself. However, if they are to serve this purpose, they must be fitted properly into a greater spiritual understanding that includes a steady insight into true and enduring values. In the absence of such spiritual understanding, scientific achievements are likely to be used destructively, thereby strengthening rather than weakening the chains which bind the spirit. The balanced progress of humanity can be assured only if science and religion proceed hand in hand. The coming civilization of the new humanity will not be ensouled by dry intellectual doctrine, but by living spiritual experience. It will be free from a life of limitation and will enjoy unhampered the creative life of the spirit. It will break away from attachment to external form and learn to live by the claims of the spirit. The limited life of illusion will be replaced by unlimited life in the truth. And the limitations by which the separative self lives will wither away at the touch of true understanding. Spiritual experience has a grip on deeper truths that are inaccessible to intellect. Spiritual truths can often be stated through the intellect, and the intellect is certainly of some help in the communication of spiritual experience. But by itself, the intellect is insufficient to bring spiritual experience to man or to allow him to communicate it to others. If two persons have had headaches, they can use the intellect to discuss their mutual experience. But if one of them has never had a headache, no amount of intellectual explanation will ever tell him what a headache is. A man must have had a headache to know truly what it is. And in order that he understand it, he may have to be hit on the head. Intellectual explanation can never be a substitute for spiritual experience. At best, it can only prepare the ground for that experience. Marian, are you ready to read?
Yes, thank you. The fact that spiritual experience involves more than intellect alone can grasp is often emphasized by calling it a mystical experience. Mysticism is frequently regarded as opposed to intellectuality, obscure, confused, impractical, unconnected with reality. But in fact, true mysticism is none of these. There is nothing irrational in true mysticism when it is, as it should be, a vision of reality. It is a form of perception that is absolutely unclouded, so practical that it can be lived in every moment of life, and so deeply connected with experience that, in a sense, it is the final understanding of all experience. When spiritual experience is described as mystical, one should not assume that it involves something unnatural or beyond the grasp of consciousness. The only implication is that the experience cannot be comprehended by the limited human intellect unless it transcends its limits and is illumined by direct realization of the infinite. The spiritual understanding that will enliven the new humanity can never fail to accept the stern realities of life and its demands. Those who cannot adapt readily to life tend to recoil from it and to look to a fortress of self-created illusions for protection. Such a reaction is an attempt to perpetuate one's separate existence by protecting it from the demands made by life. At best, this can only give a seeming solution by providing a false sense of safety arising from a false sense of self-sufficiency. It does not even constitute progress towards a final solution. On the contrary, it is a sidetrack from the true path. Again and again, fresh and irresistible waves of life will beat upon man and dislodge him from the illusory shelters within which he hides. He will only invite fresh forms of suffering upon himself by trying through escape to preserve his separative existence. Only when he faces about, awakened and supple, will he find himself clothed in the security of the inner self. Just as the individual may try to preserve his sense of separative individuality by escape, so he may also try to retain it through an uncritical identification with forms and rituals, or with traditions and conventions. All these are preponderantly fetters which restrain the release of infinite life. If they were a plastic medium that might be readily molded and suffused by unlimited life, they would be an asset in fulfilling the divine life on earth. Generally, though, they tend to gather prestige in their own right and to develop independently of the life they were intended to express. When this happens, all attachment to them eventually entails a drastic restriction of life. Even as the individual may try to hold on to his separative existence through escape into self-created illusions, so he may also attempt to hold on to it by identification with some narrow class, creed, sect, or religion, or by division based upon sex. He may seem to have lost his separative existence through identification with a larger whole. But more often, this identification becomes a means of expressing his separative existence. This he accomplishes through feeling separate from those who belong to another class, nationality, creed, sect, religion, or sex. Thus, his sense of separation from the contrasting group is more fundamental than his sense of identification with the members of his own group. The strength, in fact, the very being of separative existence, is derived from identification of the self with one of two opposites. This results automatically in distinction from the other opposite. Real merging of the limited self can only be achieved in the ocean of universal life. This involves the surrender of all sense of contradistinction in form, belief, or action, the surrender of all separative existence in all categories. The large mass of humanity is deeply enmeshed in these separative and assertive tendencies. And one who looks on at this spectacle is bound to feel the blackest despair. It is true that the readily observable forces of lust, hate, and greed cause incalculable suffering. But even in the most passionately disruptive forces, there is some form of redemptive love. Buried in the muck of human misery are seed pearls of the greatest perfection, and these precious gems of individual action and feeling are not lost, but require only threading on the strong cord of spiritual knowledge. Those who despair for mankind, and particularly in time of war, should know that real possibilities for the new humanity exist, and they will come into being through a release of love in measureless abundance. This release of love can come through spiritual awakening brought about by the masters. Love can never be born of mere determination. Through the exercise of will, one can be dutiful at best. Through struggle and persistence, it is possible to mold external action to conform to one's concept of right. But such results are spiritually barren because they lack the inner warmth of real love. Love and coercion can never sit side by side holding hands. Love springs spontaneously from within, but although love can never be forced from or upon another, it can be awakened through love itself. Essentially, love is self-communicative. Those who do not have it catch it from those who have it. For one cannot absorb love without making a response. Regardless of the barnacles which may cover the surface, the response is stamped by the nature of love. The secret of true love is that it is unconquerable and irresistible. Even the one who resists its approach is lost as he springs to plug the hole through which it is flowing past the walls of his heart. It races behind him, and he turns only in time to find himself surrounded and borne aloft on its irresistible might. True love gathers power and spreads itself until it transforms everyone it touches. Humanity will attain to a new mode of life through the unhampered interplay of pure love as it spreads from heart to heart. When it has been recognized that there are no claims greater than those of the universal divine life that encompasses all, then love will establish peace, harmony, and happiness in all of the social spheres, and it will shine forth over all in its unequaled purity and beauty. Divine love cannot be dimmed by the clouds of duality, for it is an expression of divinity itself. It is through this very divine love that the new humanity will tune itself to the divine note. Divine love will not only introduce imperishable sweetness and infinite bliss into personal life, but it will also be the means by which the new humanity will be made possible. Through divine love, the new humanity will learn the art of cooperative and harmonious life. It will free itself from the tyranny of dead forms and release the creative life of spiritual wisdom. It will shed all illusions and become established in truth. It will enjoy peace and abiding happiness. It will be initiated into the life of eternity. It has been said that war cannot be considered entirely bad, although it can hardly be considered entirely good either. There are deep-seated reasons for the occurrence of war. And when one finds oneself in the middle of the Holocaust, it is helpful to have a few guiding principles. People should face the circumstances of war with courage and the faith that no sacrifice is too great when the call of duty is clear. In the event of aggressive attack, all must resist it by direct combat if there is no alternative. But as each individual makes such resistance, he must be certain that he is motivated solely by a sense of duty, without hatred or bitterness towards the aggressor, who has acted out of spiritual ignorance. Further, he must not be insensitive to the suffering inflicted. On the contrary, he must render every possible aid to the victims of war. The fact that a person is a spiritual aspirant does not release him from his duty to the social whole. This may involve some deep soul searching, because spiritual aspirants tend to be indifferent to war on the grounds that most wars are actuated by purely material considerations. It is a mistake to divorce spirituality from material considerations, for the latter have some spiritual importance. It is not by ignoring human suffering, but by handling it with creative love that the gate is opened to life eternal. It is not through callous indifference, but by active and selfless service that one attains the transcendental and illimitable truth that lies at the heart of the illusory universe. Spiritual aspirants are rooted in the conviction of the reality and the eternity of the infinite soul. It should be easy for them to stake life itself on the performance of a duty that springs from the claims of the spirit. The duty of the spiritually enlightened one is an extension of the duties of the average person and of the spiritual aspirant. He is alive to the truth that all souls are one, and the role he must play in this game of God's is necessarily determined by the spiritual illumination he has. He performs his duty in cooperation with the divine will. Being in tune with the infinite truth, he is not only free from all thoughts of selfish gain, but also from the backlash of hate, malice, and revenge. War cannot create any real cleavage, even between the people who are fighting against one another. These people seem to be different from one another because they have different minds and bodies. But when judged from the point of view of their souls, all differences are not only secondary, but simply false. The spiritual unity of all souls remains inviolable in spite of all wars. And from the point of view of ultimate reality, no soul is really at war with any other soul. There can be a war between ideologies, which may extend to and involve the minds and even the bodies of the people. But the undivided and indivisible soul remains one in its impeachable, integral unity. All those who must undergo the rigors of war have great need for equanimity. It will be profitable to remember that the soul remains unscathed by the destruction of material things, and death itself is only a gateway to further life. Therefore, those who would play their part well in the divine game should remain unmoved by bereavement and loss, imparting to others a spirit of cheerful resignation to the divine will. Due to lack of spiritual insight, sufferings of war inevitably embitter many persons, and they need to be helped to recover a sense of the unspoilable sweetness of life. Those who have been initiated into the eternal values of inner life must assume the responsibility of driving away unwarranted gloom and depression and cheering those who are in deep sorrow. When crisis is upon one, let one's thoughts not be for self, but for others, for the claims of the divine self, which exists equally in all. War cannot be justified merely because it brings certain spiritual values. War cannot be justified merely because it brings certain spiritual qualities as byproducts, for those qualities can also be developed in time of peace. It is time now for humanity to develop a spontaneous spirit of love and service, rather than require the stimulus provided by danger to precipitate unselfish action. All should face the crisis of war with patience, fortitude, and self-sacrifice, never forgetting that the redemption of a distracted humanity through divine love is much closer than one dreams at such a time. Shall I continue?
Yes, unless you need a rest, Marian.
No, this is very, very compelling.
Awesome. Continue then.
Chapter 4, the New World Culture. The East has had and will continue to have great influence on the spiritual heritage of the world, and therefore upon the outlines of the new humanity. For all its material backwardness, the East remains spiritual. For ages, it has been the home of avatars, prophets, masters, seers, and sages, whose contribution to the spiritual evolution of humanity has been unparalleled. It is essential that the spiritual atmosphere of the East be maintained, even at the cost, if necessary, of material unhappiness. If the East's spiritual power and value are retained, the suffering of her people will finally be supplanted by happiness. The current problems of the East are more complex in some ways than those the West is required to solve. Men of all races, creeds, cults, and religions are to be found in the East. Although this lack of racial and cultural uniformity has presented difficulties in developing solidarity in the national life of the East, it must not be regarded as being an unrelieved handicap. The various streams of culture pouring into the life history of the East in particular, and of the world in general, have added to the wealth of its resources. They have not only created a suitable opportunity for the generation of a new cultural synthesis, but have required its emergence. Under deft and creative leadership, such conflicting elements can bring a rich new culture into existence, capable of rejuvenating and harmonizing the life of the whole world. A new, cohesive, vital culture cannot be brought to life by a purely mechanical combination of isolated elements selected from present cultures. This could only result in a vague patchwork with no spontaneous life of its own. Such a hodgepodge of assembled ideas can never be a substitute for that essential element from which a new culture must be generated: a direct, fresh perception of the goal. The new world culture must emerge from an integral vision of truth, springing independent of existing traditions and unrelated to any laborious compilation of historical values. The new world culture, born from the new humanity and its integral vision, will automatically involve a cultural synthesis. The vision that inspires the new culture will be comprehensive. It will not deny the value of diverse traditions, nor will it merely accord them patronizing tolerance. On the contrary, it will entail active appreciation of the diverse religions and cultures. This vast vision of the truth cannot be limited by any creed, dogma, or sect. It will actively help men to transcend these limitations, not by blind negation of the value of the existing creeds, but by discovering, accentuating, unfolding, and cherishing the facets of truth which are in them. Another task which confronts the creative leadership of the East is to strive for political poise in spite of the difficult position the East occupies in international circles. The East can never make its full contribution to the world unless it is free from external political domination and fear of foreign aggression. Insistence upon this fundamental point, though, should not disturb its political poise, nor push it into a vitiated and reactionary isolationism. On the other hand, any future discharging of the clear duty to resist foreign aggression should not involve it in a sense of hate, malice, or revenge. This in turn raises the perplexing question of the utilization of nonviolence, which has been such an active tool in India's recent past. Aggression must be met with resistance, and in such case, nonviolence is impractical. Pure nonviolence, or incorruptible love, only comes spontaneously when duality has been completely transcended in the realization of the last and only truth. Even nonviolence of the brave is possible only for advanced souls who have eradicated all forms of greed and hate from their minds through rigorous discipline. For the masses, it is undesirable to adhere to external nonviolence when it is a question of clear duty to resist aggression in their own defense or in the defense of weaker brothers. Insistence upon universal nonviolence can only lead the masses to a cowardly, irresponsible, and inert attitude. True love is no game for the faint-hearted and the weak. It is born of strength and understanding. In its enthusiasm for the highest ideal, wise leadership can never afford to lose sight of the relative and practical. Human evolution proceeds by gradual stages from selfish violence to unselfish violence, and then from nonviolence of the brave to the pure and incorruptible nonviolence of truth as infinite love. Each individual exists at some point in this succession, and his duty in time of war is indelibly determined by that position. All narrowness limits love. In the East, as in the rest of the world, humanity is breaking itself into narrow groups based upon caste, creed, race, nationality, religion, or culture. All this is due to ignorance, prejudice, and selfishness. It can only be mended by fostering a spirit of mutuality, which will derive its strength from a sense of the inviolable unity of all life. Creative leadership will have to recognize and then emphasize the fact that all men are already united, not only by their co-partnership in the great divine plan for the earth, but also by the fact that they are all equally the expression of the one life. No line of action can be really fruitful unless it is in complete harmony with this truth. There must be love for friend and foe, goodwill, patience, and forbearance. Man must try to remedy his own defects instead of clamoring about the faults of others. The world will soon realize that neither cults, creeds, and ceremonies on the one hand, nor passionate striving for material welfare on the other, can ever bring about real happiness. But that selfless love and universal brotherhood can accomplish it.
Thank you, Marian. Mahu, are you ready to read?
Yes. The future of humanity is in the hands of those who have this vision, and the role of the East in that future will be an irreplaceable one. If it needs its spiritual and human resources together into a creative synthesis of its ancient heritage. Chapter 5, Notes on Freedom. Throughout the ages, the voice of mankind has been lifted up in a great clamor for freedom. The love and quest for freedom are principal characteristics of humanity, regardless of race, time, nationality, or geography. But in spite of the fact that freedom has been the watchword of groping mankind for so many thousands of years, there are very few persons who really understand the full implications of true freedom. There are many, though, who struggle to attain a relative freedom dictated by their partial understanding of the nature and conditions of true freedom. Thus, different persons long for different kinds of freedom according to the different things they have come to value. Relative freedom, which is the brand of freedom usually involved, is the brand of freedom usually involved, is sought in all phases of life, and is usually related to the type of existence people wish to lead. For instance, those who identify themselves with their country instinctively work for national or political freedom. Those who are motivated by economic considerations strive for economic freedom. Those who are inspired by religious drives work toward religious freedom. Those who espouse some sociological or cultural ideology promote freedom of movement or speech. The localized freedom which grows from these limited goals is illusory and can only be termed a contrasting state in which the reverse of the discomforting situation prevails. It is a freedom of ignorance in which there is at least a transitory peace and plenty, and passing relief and enjoyment. Regardless of the material bindings of the good and the bad, spiritual freedom is always at hand, ready to be grasped by man. This is true because man's inherent spiritual freedom of soul is eternal, infinite, and changeless, regardless of whether it is experienced with full human consciousness or not. Few realize that this is the basic freedom. It alone can give the stamp of true value to the different kinds of relative freedom. For in the long run, they are all dissolved in it. Even when the external conditions of a free life are completely fulfilled and guaranteed, the mind of man will still be in a straitjacket of man has failed to win a spiritual freedom. External relative freedom is inevitably restricted by contact with other individuals. Therefore, external freedom is subject to redefinition and restriction within the limits imposed by group, communal, and national living. Inevitably, national rights in turn become subject to adjudication or violent readjustment because of the overlapping quote-unquote rights of other nations. The constant judgment of these so-called rights at all levels is completely incapable of final solution within the spheres of interest and controlling principles natural to them. Consciously or unconsciously, individuals as well as nations must draw upon a more reliable concept of freedom, within which those rights may be resolved. National, economic, religious, and cultural freedoms are the reflection of the duality of existence. They exist only in varying degrees, subject to constant discordant adjustment. Even when won through persistent effort, they cannot be permanently maintained because the external conditions upon which they have been constructed are themselves subject to deterioration. Only spiritual freedom is absolute and unlimited. When it is won through persistent effort, it is won forever. For although spiritual freedom can and does express itself in the duality of existence, it is grounded in and sustained by the realization of the inviolable unity of all life. One important condition of spiritual freedom is freedom from all wanting. It is wanting itself which changes life by attaching to it the conditions in environment which would fulfill that want. If there is no wanting, there is no dependence and therefore no limitation. The individual never achieves a true freedom until he is no longer pushed or pulled by any inner compulsion. When he has worked through all the desires and worn them so threadbare that he can be or not be, have or have not, then he is free. It is here that the perfect masters are indispensable in helping to lighten the crushing burden of trying to wear out and discard the wants. When the individualized soul breaks through the encasing steel armor of wanting, it emancipates itself from its illusory bondage to bodies, mind, and ego. This is the spiritual freedom, which brings with it the final realization of the unity of all life and puts an end to all doubts and worries. Fully conscious, eternal experience of spiritual freedom is the inevitable and final destination for all life and for each individual being. The method for abandoning the hold which duality has on consciousness is not simple, the more comfort and pleasure available to man, the less his chance for a strong enough push to force him to give up even the temporary happiness of his achievements. And yet, he must eventually do this internally to bring the full focus of consciousness to bear on the experience of the eternally inherent self or soul with all its blissful freedom of real existence. This is why God loves most the so-called destitute and helpless. The greater the helplessness, the greater can and should be the dependence upon God for his help, which is ever more ready than are the sincere and earnest wishes for it. The greater the bindings, the greater the chances for quick, permanent relief through fully conscious experience of man's own original and everlasting freedom. The unlimited and everlasting spiritual freedom of the self or soul exists eternally and infinitely in one and all, and is equally available to every man and woman, irrespective of class, creed, or nationality. Spiritual freedom can and does transcend all the illusory phenomena of duality, because divine oneness is always divine oneness, before the beginningless beginning and beyond the endless end. Contrarily, the illusion of all material binding from first to last is always illusion, and even its illusory existence depends upon the play of the eternal spiritual freedom of the soul. It is only the spiritual freedom that one can enduring happiness, it is only in a spiritual freedom that one can have enduring happiness and unhampered self-knowledge. It is only in a spiritual freedom that one finds the supreme certainty of true realization. It is only in a spiritual freedom that there is a final end to sorrow and limitation. It is only in a spiritual freedom that one can live for all and yet remain detached in the midst of all activity. Any other lesser type of freedom is like a house built on sand, and any lesser attainment is fraught with fear of decay. There is no gift greater than that of a spiritual freedom, and no task more important than helping others to find a spiritual freedom. Those who have understood the supreme importance of a spiritual freedom must not only strive for it themselves, but also share the God-given duty of helping others win it. Regardless of whether man is wealthy or poor, highly educated or illiterate, the only real help is to give him the perfect hope that everyone has a really equal opportunity to achieve everlasting freedom from all bindings. Helping others achieve spiritual freedom is very different from rendering other types of help. For the hungry, one can provide food and they have only to eat it. For the naked, one can provide clothes and they have only to wear it. For the homeless, one can provide houses and they have only to live in them. But for those who experience the agonies of human bondage, there is no ready means of providing immediate relief except by the grace of God. As a rule, spiritual freedom must be won through watchful and unfailing war against the lower self and its desires. Those who would help shoulder the load in the cause of truth have not only the responsibility of attaining the goal for themselves, but of extending love and understanding to others in every step which they take towards the attainment. There is no other way of sharing their burden. Real help in achieving the perfect hope of attaining spiritual freedom can only be given by the perfect master, who has achieved with full consciousness the freedom of the self, and at the same time continues to be fully conscious of the illusion of duality. From him, true and great help can be obtained, for he has experienced 100% of the truth of spiritual freedom and is 100% confident that the truth is real. Such a perfect master can give relief to humanity from immediate ignorance, as well as relief to the individual from, quote, continual ignorance. But direct help from a perfect master is rarely available, and so each individual must help others in every field of life to the utmost of his capacity. First, however, he must take every possible precaution against the development in himself of a sense of obliging or of obligation in the receiver. This is best achieved by a feeling of pure love between man and man. Such selfless love springs from the profound understanding that each individual, on achieving full human consciousness, has arrived at the same threshold of infinite divine oneness. Each human being does possess, therefore, a truly equal spiritual opportunity to achieve the oneness of a spiritual freedom, which is potentially as complete in himself as in others. Even though one may have tried to take every precaution to avoid any sense of obligation in the help one gives, undoubtedly there is every chance of this element entering to some extent through either giver or receiver. Still, this should be no cause for hesitation in rendering whatever relief one can provide. Although extending help to others is fraught with the danger of endlessly multiplying misery for both giver and receiver, man must nevertheless help his fellow with the same care that he meets his own needs. There are further questions of great importance in rendering help to a suffering humanity, such as temporary versus permanent relief. Often, a sharp choice must be made when immediate relief is likely to turn a curable case into an incurable one, or to spread the infection to others. Insistence upon immediate relief and refusal to try for a permanent cure is unthinkable. Similarly, there is no real value in helping if one robs Peter in order to pay Paul. There is no point in giving relief at one end by creating misery at the other. The question of pity for the suffering and downtrodden is almost a moot one. Such expressions of pity in themselves are an expression of ignorance, as pity itself is invariably based on unconscious denial of the equal capacity for everlasting freedom of the self. There is no truth in the myth that the well-fed, well-clothed, well-educated can best find God. On the contrary, the so-called rich are comparatively more handicapped by fleeting comfort and mercurial resources than are those who feel chained by their material needs. Since God loves the afflicted ones most, to emphasize their helplessness is to act in ignorance of their true state of grace. Instead of making them think more and more about their helplessness, they must be made to come nearer and nearer to God. Instead of stressing the limitations of some men, the emphasis should be placed on the limitations of all men. Instead of stressing the need that quote unquote I help quote unquote you, or quote unquote you help me, it should be we helping us. Instead of making ourselves and others helpless minded, we should become and help others to become helpful minded. The relative difference between man and man in material resources or physical endowment becomes lost like a mote of the dust in the infinitely greater resources of the inner self, the treasure house of all. It must be impressed constantly upon humanity that the real birthright of every man and woman is to achieve his own original freedom, that it can be achieved, and that sooner or later it must be achieved. Without this, there is no lasting escape from the day-to-day problems of duality. Men must be made to understand clearly that their present life is a chain of continuous strife, that this chain is composed of links of the opposite experiences of virtue and sin, service and tyranny, etc. And the chain can never be permanently ended as long as ignorance is not eliminated by achieving the eternal experience of one's own self. Except in cases of complete physical helplessness, help can be best given by offering the individual work and making him feel that he is fit to do work. Yet even this help is superfluous when judged from the standpoint of spirituality. Real help that can be rendered humanity is to make man feel this inherent divinity and to cause him to see that the only purpose of life is to love God in order to become one in full consciousness with him. No sacrifice is too great to set man free from spiritual bondage and help him achieve spiritual freedom. This alone can bring peace to all, sustained unfailingly by the unassailable sense of universal fellowship and cemented by an ungrudging love for all as expressions of the same reality.
Thank you, Mahu. So we're on page 151 for next time.
Okay.
And
Oh,
let me turn off the recording. Where are you? Here.
okay.